From the post-war years through really the mid to late 1960s, the United States is going to enter a period of economic prosperity like none other. Our economy was booming. And this is the era where we really have the heyday of the middle class in America because of the affluence, the wealth of our society. And this middle class is growing very rapidly through the 1950s. Fortune magazine estimated that the middle class grew by over 1 million families every year in the 1950s. And these people are going to enjoy the highest standard of living in the whole world. At the time, even in nations like Britain, they were still experiencing rationing until the mid 50s from the wartime. And the United States, that's all long gone, long gone. Their standard of living is so high, in fact, that the new Soviet premier who takes over after Stalin's death in '52 is Nikita Khrushchev, and he says it's fake. You're putting out propaganda. Nobody lives that well, and he truly believed that, because in July of 1959, in order to sort of help foster relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Soviets put on a display of typical Soviet life in America, and Americans put on a display of a typical model middle class home in the Soviet Union, in Moscow. And it was staffed by wives of the embassy staff. So, you know, like the ambassador's wife and so on. So when they're looking at the kitchen, Nixon goes over to, who was vice president under Eisenhower at the time, Richard Nixon, goes over to Moscow, and he and Khrushchev tour the thing together. Now, Khrushchev doesn't really speak English. Nixon speaks no Russian. So they have an interpreter, and Khrushchev says flat out, "This is a lie," and they argue about it, and right there in front of God and everybody. But he says that Khrushchev says, "This is a lie, but the Soviet Union will provide such comforts to all of their citizens soon." And of course, they never did. And the reason is because the Soviet economy never did have the excess capacity to provide what amounts to luxury goods, luxury consumer goods, things like dishwashers or washing machines and dryers. In America, we sort of think of those as just sort of basic household things, but in reality, those are luxuries. You don't have to have those things in order to survive. But because America was, in a single word, affluent, and you'll notice I've used that word a couple of times. You might want to remember it. Look up what it means. We did have those things because we just were a wealthy society. And here's a photo taken during that kitchen debate showing what we're talking about. They just had this shot of the model homes, open kitchen, and Khrushchev is here fussing at Nixon, and Nixon is talking to the woman that's just sort of displaying everything to everyone. A big part of the reason why the United States is so wealthy is that they have come to basically dominate the world's economy, much like China kind of does now. And it's partially because of the Bretton Woods system, which is going to sort of create a global trade climate very, very friendly to the United States. And it's named for a UN conference on economics held in a place called Bretton Woods in the United States in 1944. And it's based on three economic institutions, which they pretty much set up there. The World Bank, which makes loans for developing nations at low interest, but it makes loans to them, making capital available for them to purchase things. The International Money Fund, or the IMF, which works to stabilize currencies and uses the United States dollar as the benchmark. And this is why, particularly in old movies, if you look at very old movies, they discuss things in terms of pounds sterling. In the original movies, unless it's a movie just only set in America. But if they're talking about big international deals, they talked about it in terms of pounds sterling, because the British currency, which is what that is, was very, very stable. There's even a saying, sound is the British pound. But after World War II, and the Bretton Woods system starts off with the IMF, they shift from talking about the pound to U.S. dollars. And so the U.S. dollar becomes the benchmark for international trade. Everybody wants to do business in dollars now. And that helps promote the value of the U.S. currency, which means it buys more in other places. And the last of these things is the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was, I believe, originally passed in 47, signed by something like 19 or 20 countries, and then it was revamped in 1994 to change some things up. But basically, it sets a multinational framework for trade practices, things like tariffs and stuff like that. They discuss in the newer one international laws on intellectual property and stuff like that, copyrights and violations of that and such. But what this does is this system will guide the post-war global economy, and it really favors the United States, making it much easier to sell American-made goods to developing nations. The World Bank loans them the money. They go out and they buy equipment to build, say, I don't know, a shoe factory. And where are they going to be able to buy the equipment? Well, the United States is making it. Why isn't Germany or Britain or the Soviets or whatever? Right after the war, those countries don't have much in the way of industry anymore. They've been seriously damaged by the war. U.S. industrial capacity was not. And so the U.S. shifts all of that massive industrial capacity that they used to help win World War II over into either consumer goods or the production of what they call capital goods, which is stuff like machines to make shoes or whatever. So they shift over to that, and we're in the right place at the right time, and we have the things that people need, and we can sell it to them because now we've set up a system where it makes it easier to trade with America and where it makes the money available. So we offer American capital to nations that will adopt capitalist free market economies, i.e. they're not communists, because we kind of control the World Bank and the IMF. And so we really create a system which for the next 25, 30 years is going to make sure, essentially, that the United States is going to do well. And boy, do we ever. Another one of the things that is helping to drive this post-war prosperity is massive defense spending caused by the Cold War tensions. And we've discussed that a little bit when we look at Eisenhower doing the New Look defense program, and then when the Soviets developed their own atomic weapons, how we have to shift back to a more traditional with large numbers of troops, but also trying to maintain that technological edge. And so we spend billions of dollars sending people to school to become scientists and engineers and inventors and things like that. We spend billions of dollars trying to keep our technological edge. That goes into development of missile systems, electronics, computers, aircraft, all kinds of things. Permanent peacetime mobilization at this scale, and with so much of our money being spent on it. 10% of the U.S. gross domestic product was being spent on defense spending. That means $1 out of every 10 made in the United States was for the defense industry. That's a lot, or directly. And so what it does is it helps to create these intertwined ties between the governments and industry and scientific / college university community. okay? And they become dependent on each other. And this is known as the military-industrial complex. Federal spending on science education pours millions of dollars into colleges, which puts out, aerospace, let's just say aerospace engineers to help design new planes, new jets and things. And then those guys need to go to work. And so they go to work for, say, Boeing. And defense spending to Boeing makes a ton of money for Boeing. They're building so they've paid for this person's education, and then he goes off to work at Boeing, and defense spending is going to help pay for him to continue to work and design the next newest, fastest, coolest plane that will help defend America from the godless commies. And so it continues. Corporations, not Boeing as much, but many companies get to the point where 70 to 80% of all of their income comes from continued military spending, and they become dependent on that. They can't stay in business. They grow their business so big, but they're dependent on this big government contracts. And so, of course, they're going to work to make sure that people get elected that support that. It gets so big that 1 out of every 7 jobs, about 15% of all jobs, is dependent on this by the 1960s. And it's not just directly the people working at, say, Boeing, but also the people that service Boeing. Okay, so think about it. Boeing's got this great big plant, and they've got to hire people to clean the place, right? And so those people work there, and they probably were direct employees of Boeing for security reasons and such. But they also have to get in cleaning supplies, right? And so because they need cleaning supplies, and probably in large quantities, that means that somebody has to drive a truck full of cleaning supplies to Boeing probably every couple of weeks just to keep them in floor wax, right? Which also means that somebody has to make all that floor wax to keep the floors of the factory nice and clean and shiny and smooth. Okay, so that is a direct result of the need that Boeing has. Boeing has that need as a direct result of military spending. So see, it all ties together. Okay. The downside of this developing military-industrial complex, and Eisenhower was worried about this happening. He actually saw it kind of coming to pass in the 50s while he was president, and he said, "Guys, you may want to, watch out for this." When he was kind of on his way out after his second term, in going into 1960, but he said, you got to watch out for this because it's going to increase industrial involvement and influence in government. And that's what he was concerned about. The other thing that it does that's a downside is that if you're spending that much of the government's money on defense spending, then there's less money to be spent on other things like healthcare or roads or schools or whatever. Okay. Because there's only so much taxation that people are willing to pay. And so there's a kind of a limit to how much money they could tax in, and that puts a cap on how much money they can spend, sort of. And here's a pretty cool little diagram that shows how they all get sort of intertwined. With the large military contractors, you can also add universities over to that area, as well as Department of Defense, because both of those points are going to be tied into the university system as well. So Congress provides tax funding to the Department of Defense. They approve spending. Department of Defense then sends out contracts to large military contractors or researchers in the case of universities. Those military contractors then use part of that money to make campaign contributions to congressmen and candidates at all levels of government that will support additional funding for defense, because that's how they make their money. And it just goes around and around and around, and it's all powered by money. But you know, it seems to have worked fairly well. From 1945 to 1960, the gross domestic product will more than double. And 1945, our GDP was really good. Industry was booming. Now it was largely military production, defense production rather than consumer production. But all they do is shift over. All they do is shift over. And so instead of making Jeeps, they start making pickup trucks, right? By 1970, in 10 years, it's going to double again. And for the very first time in 1970, the gross domestic product of any nation will exceed $1 trillion. And that's, of course, the U.S.'s. Standards of living will increase. Wages go up. Inflation is kept low. People bought tons of stuff. Income inequality drops. There is less of a difference between the income of a man and a woman. There is less of a difference between incomes of white and non-white employees. Unemployment was very low. It was only about 3 or 4%, which is pretty darn low. And the percentage of people who owned homes is skyrocketing. Basically, every major economic trend is upward, and for 25, 30 years. Partly as a result of all of this affluence, all of this available wealth, all of this cash to hand, and partly as a result of sort of a reaction against the period where during the Depression and during the war, people were denied lots of consumer comforts and things. We just go nuts with buying stuff, but people are still saving money as well. So it's really a crazy time, and we start spending a lot of money. One of the things people spend money on is college. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill, is going to finance educations for veterans, and 7.8 million people will attend college or trade schools. And we needed these guys, right? We needed these professionals. A big chunk of the college-educated men had been killed during World War II because officers almost always had to have college degrees. Almost every officer killed was one of the relatively small percentage of Americans who had a college degree. And so there are massive gaps in our teachers, in our professors, in our lawyers and doctors and engineers and all of these scientists and things, all of these guys that had gone off to fight a war and never came back. And so we really need to push this. And a lot of the people, that's the sort of thing that they do. They go into the more practical professions where they know they're going to be able to get a job afterward, engineers and doctors and such. Another thing that the Readjustment Act is going to do, the GI Bill is going to do, is provide low-cost mortgages. And that's going to help be part of what builds 2.5 million new homes. And remember, when you build a house, you're not just paying the people who built the house. You're paying all of the people who bring the lumber and cut down the trees, and who made the bricks and the mortar and the paint and all of those things. Also, all the people who made all of the light fixtures and the furniture and I mean, every little piece of that house, somebody had to make. And so you're promoting all of those other jobs as well. And this is going to help build up the middle class, right? Because these guys are going to be college educated. They're going to get better jobs, better paying jobs than they would have had typically. That's going to help them enter the middle class. They'll be able to buy nicer homes because they've got better mortgages. They've got low interest mortgages with lower minimums to get into it. And it's just, it helps push all of this boom. All of these things are sort of contributing to it. They all work together. Meanwhile, the unions aren't just sitting around either. Organized labor becomes a major factor in the national economy. The AFL and the CIO are going to merge together in 1955, becoming this massive super organization of unions. And they're going to work to make sure that collective bargaining becomes the basic method for setting terms of employment. And in many places, it is. Okay. The South, we're not as used to it down here in the South, particularly in Texas. Texas is not a real strong union state. We have unions, but we don't have a lot of laws in Texas that are very supportive of unions. Okay. But through collective bargaining, worker wages do increase. People start to get more time off, holidays, weekends, vacation times. They start to offer pensions and health insurance through the company as part of their union labor contracts. And this is all possible because of the booming economy of the 1950s. There is plenty of money coming in, and the companies can afford these things. And so they say, hey, look, while the sales are good, I can't afford a strike. I can't afford a shutdown because my competitors will gobble up my my market share. So I've got to keep my employees happy, and they give out contracts that are nice and juicy. This is great until the boom starts to slow, and then the companies can't afford to pay for all of these things that their contract says they have to. Another issue is that, of course, casual laborers, low-end wage workers, those people, they don't participate in this. They don't really have unions. Service workers are pretty much left out of it. Many of those jobs are filled by minorities, and therefore minorities to a large degree missed out on some of this. But it's not universal. Okay, everybody's standard of living is increasing no matter what. Okay, the availability of goods, the prevalence of money, wages are increasing for everyone. Not as fast in some segments as in others, but everybody's is going up. There's an old saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's basically what's happening here. Everybody is doing better off. Some people are just doing better at a faster rate. They're improving more than others. Now, as far as consumers go, the three big things people were spending money on were houses, cars, and kids. And together, this is even a bigger deal than the military-industrial complex when you combine all of these things together. They build 25 million new homes. That's a lot of houses. That's an incredible number of houses. And each of these homes has to have, like I mentioned before, sinks and plumbing and all, just everything. And that puts a huge number of people to work. Even the people that have to build the roads to go to the houses and go past the houses and put in the sewer pipes and all of this. And I mean, the construction of entire new suburb neighborhoods. We'll talk about the burbs here in a few minutes. That's an entire industry all in itself. And the building of businesses in those areas to help support those neighborhoods and everything. It's just crazy how interrelated all of this is. And this is why economies are such complicated things. Everything is very interrelated and relies on lots and lots of different pieces. People start buying cars. People start buying lots of cars. Before World War II, many families had a car, one. In the 1950s, the two-car household became the standard for the middle class. Dad had a car to go to work. Mom had a car to take the kids to soccer practice and whatnot. Okay, they didn't really play much soccer, but piano lessons and baseball practice and go pick up the groceries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the teenagers become teens, they start getting cars of their own, especially the boys. And that was before the 1950s, really before, that was just a crazy talk. What do you mean your teenager has a car? That was something only very wealthy people did. But that changes. Okay, kids encourage consumption. You think about how many diapers these 75 million kids of the post-war baby boom needed. They created the disposable diaper industry. Created it. It didn't exist before this. Before this, it was all cloth diapers that you had to clean yourself or send off to a diaper service, which was a job. Um, and so there are 75 million kids born in the baby boom from 1946 to 1964. That's the official years of the baby boom. I am not a boomer, nor were my parents. My parents were born just before it. I was born about 8 years after. But this is almost 40% of the American population. Almost half of the American population is in this baby boom. And what that means is that's a lot of people to sell stuff to. And American industry realizes this. And it starts with them selling things that babies need. Disposable diapers, formula, baby food, baby clothes. And then goes into, okay, they're a little bit older. Now we need toys, and we're going to start marketing TV programs to them and foods to them, you know. What kind of food do kids like? Well, they like sweet stuff and they like salty and crunchy stuff. Well, let's start marketing that more. Um, okay. And then they get a little bit older and they get interested in clothes like for, purposes of looking good for the opposite sex or the same sex in some cases, but you know what I'm saying. They get interested in buying cars, listening to music, going to the movies, going out on dates. And so that industry shifts to focus on this age group. Nowadays, what you see is them being this group that is getting older. And so now you see so many ads for things like medicine, estate planning, funeral homes, just all of these things. Why? Because those are the things this aging but still very large public segment needs now. And so throughout their lives, that's been the case. Another really popular consumer product at the time is the television, which is brand new in the 50s. It comes out in the 40s actually, but in 1947 there were so few that it was virtually an oddity. There were 7,000 TVs in the whole country in 1947. 13 years later, almost everybody had at least one. Most people only had one, but that was pretty much everybody that was in range of a broadcast station. Because remember, this is broadcast. This isn't this isn't streamed over the internet. This isn't brought in on a cable through like fiber optic systems or anything like that. This is all broadcast, just like radio. And you know, if you get too far away, you lose your radio signal, or you lose your cell phone signal. If you get too far away from any of the towers, same thing. If you're too far away, you couldn't get a signal. But the TV has such a massive impact. Really, there's only two other inventions of the 20th century that even come close. And that's the computer, which probably has more, and the automobile, which had a lot, but probably not as much as TV. Programs in the 50s and 60s, they basically showed middle-class, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant families. That was their market. That was who the people making the TV shows were marketing products to, because, you know, TV markets products. That's what they do. And so that's who they put on TV. Why? Because people tend to watch programs that they can identify with. You start to see, for example, programs that are sponsored by various different companies. We'll talk about that here in a second. One of the other interesting effects of television, besides its mass appeal, is that the broadcasts help to define national norms. Okay, this becomes a new thing. The way people talk. We start losing a lot of the dialect. The accents soften. We become more homogenized, not entirely homogenized, okay? I mean, people from places like Brooklyn still sound very strange to those of us from down in, Texas, and vice versa. I mean, they think we talk funny. They're wrong, it's them, but, hey. But it's a lot less pronounced than it used to be. Okay, and so national norms for things like speech and dress and hobbies and everything, they begin to homogenize more. They begin to become more nationwide rather than regional, even more rapidly than film and radio had been doing this. And those had had a lot of effect on this already. But TV is just because unlike film, it's there in your house, and unlike radio, it's got a visual aspect as well, which is very entrancing. And so here's a selection of some very popular TV shows from the 50s and early 60s. I Love Lucy, which was a groundbreaking program, actually, starring Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. Partly groundbreaking because Desi Arnaz was Hispanic. He was a Cuban American. And he had a leading serious role. I mean, it's a comedy show, but I mean, he was not just there for laughs like the sassy black maid character in a lot of programs was there just to be funny. He was a serious, I mean, he was a main part of the show. It's also interesting because it's the first television program which allowed a pregnant woman to be shown pregnant on television. And the reason they got that past the censors, because they had a lot of censorship back then, the reason they got that past the censors was very simple. Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball were married in real life. And this was, Lucille Ball was pregnant with his child. And the actual baby they use in the TV program was their baby, Desi Jr. So let's move on to Father Knows Best. The absolute iconic, typical example of what TV portrayed middle class America to be, America family life to be. You've got the slightly older father figure who I mean, everybody's looking up to him, and the title of it is Father Knows Best. You want to talk about supporting the patriarchal system? Boy, does that do it. There's mom decked out perfectly in her pearls and everything. The three kids all looking adoringly at dad. The oldest daughter, and who is just the apple of daddy's eye. The boy who's just a chip off the old block. His name was Bud. And the little girl who's the spunky little semi-tomboy, but she was there for being cute and funny. And in 30 minutes, all of their so-called problems could be solved with a little wisdom from dad. So Father Knows Best, just iconic. On the bottom row to the left, you've got the Cleaver family from Leave It to Beaver. Very similar kind of thing to Father Knows Best. The two boys get into a variety of minor scrapes, and mom and dad and older brother, because it's usually the youngest brother who's called Beaver, hence the title Leave It to Beaver, that gets they come and they help him out. And again, it's sort of a slice of typical America. It wasn't really all that typical, but it made it look like it because this is what you saw. Okay, and we'll talk about Mrs. Cleaver, June Cleaver, again in a little bit about how she was totally iconic. Game shows were very popular. This is a game show called What's My Line, where you had a panel of famous people over there to the left, and they're blindfolded so they couldn't see you, and they would ask, you would give them a hint as to what it was that you did for a living, your line of work. That's what they're talking about. What's my line? And then the famous people would ask questions and try to guess what it was that you did. And if you kept them guessing long enough, you won more prizes, basically. And you see where it says, Stop It presents What's My Line. You got the little picture of the little squeeze bulb thing on the panel. That's because this program was sponsored by, paid for by Stop It, which was a women's antiperspirant company. And that was a little spray antiperspirant that people was marketed to women could wear. Speaking about marketing to women, this is also how the soap operas started off. Soap operas are, if you're unaware of what a soap opera is, and I don't imagine that you could be, but anyway, what they are is these programs that typically revolve around very complex relationships of people that go on and on and on. It's an ongoing story that develops constantly. It's melodramatic, and it's designed to appeal to women. Okay, men like them too, but they're designed to appeal to women, and they come on during the day. Why? Because that's when women who of the middle class, who had money to spend, et cetera, were home and could sit and watch TV, whatever they liked, because the kids were off at school, hubby was off at work, and while they did their chores and did all their stuff, they could also take time during the day to watch their program. The Spanish version of these is telenovelas, and if you've never watched them, you absolutely owe it to yourself to watch a telenovela for a little while. They are so much fun. But anyway, they're called soap operas because the companies that paid for them, and I mean directly paid for them, they paid to have the shows put on, were dishwasher and laundry detergent companies like Tide or All or Cheer or whatever, or Ivory or whatever, and they, soap companies. And so because these were melodramatic storylines paid for by soap companies, they become known as soap operas. And why did soap companies support them, pay for them? Who's buying the soap? Mom, the housewife. She's the one who's going to be making. Do you think most dads in the 50s cared what kind of dish detergent mom used to wash the dishes? No, he didn't care a bit, as long as it wasn't too expensive, probably. But mom would pick Palmolive over Dawn or whatever, because Palmolive was helped sponsor or sponsored the show she liked, and she wanted to help keep them in business, so she keeps it. Well, that's how it worked. They also had shows marketed directly to children. Okay, now these are all pretty darn family-friendly shows. Okay, the censorship kept anything even remotely sexual out of them. I mentioned I Love Lucy, how a pregnant woman was just unheard of on television. Even though they allowed Lucy to be shown as pregnant, anytime you saw a shot in their bedroom, you saw, and this is true for a very long time, 2 separate beds. They slept in separate beds. And that was true through every TV show until the Brady Bunch. The Brady Bunch in the 1970s is the very first TV program to show a single bed for a married couple to sleep in together, even though, of course, most married couples, certainly by that point, did share one bed. But anyway, it's all about promoting a certain view of what America was like. And so the kid program there is Howdy Doody and Buffalo Bob, very famous characters. Howdy Doody is the ventriloquist dummy. Buffalo Bob is the big man there. And they had a very popular children's show, and they had live audiences and the whole 9 yards. Another big factor in society at this time was that Americans began to go back to church. Church attendance was up significantly from the years prior to and during the war, up by about 20%. And a lot of that was caused by fear, anxieties about the imminent nuclear war that is going to scour the world of life, and also the desire to look like a good, upstanding, God-fearing American, not one of those godless commies. You didn't want anybody to think that you were some sort of a communist. We discussed how that could be harmful to your career and such, and so being seen going to church was a big thing. Evangelical preachers of the time would teach that there is no moral conflict between faith and material prosperity. Being rich is okay, according to these fellows, that it's not a threat to your entrance into heaven. Billy Graham is probably the most well-known and most popular of these evangelistic type preachers. He went on tours, did massive speaking engagements. There's a photo here of Billy Graham at the Olympic Coliseum in 1963 with 134,000 people watching. The place was packed. My wife's grandmother actually attended this. We have her ticket stub somewhere from when she passed on. She was just one of the things that I saw and I took because no one else cared about it, and I thought it was a neat little historical relic. But they made radio and TV programs. They made records of them preaching and sold those. They had magazines and just periodicals and everything. And this era is sometimes been known as the Third Great Awakening, because there was such a resurgence of religious feeling. I mentioned a few minutes ago the rise in suburban living in suburbia, and so that's what we're going to discuss now. Part of what makes suburban living practical or possible is the development during this time period of additional roadways, and in particular the interstate highway system. The National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956 was going to provide $26 billion over the course of 10 years to construct a massive network of highways. And here's the original plan. Okay, the original plan from the 1950s. The point of these was, at least according to the law, was to ease evacuation in case of a nuclear attack. Of course, there's not anywhere near enough time from the start of a nuclear attack till the end of the nuclear attack for anybody to do anything but just, kiss your loved ones goodbye. Theoretically, the highways could act as emergency runways if there was a war and we needed places to land our airplanes because their bases had been bombed. Okay, one of the things that it does in fact do is lead to a decline in the use of railroads and an increase in the amount of goods carried by truck and an increase in the size of those trucks until you get our modern day big old 18-wheelers. So that's going to hurt the railroad industry, but it also helps increase driving tourism. With these big networks of very high quality roads, you see an increase in road tourism because it's safer and easier to get places. And people, again, that helps drive the car industry, drive, no pun intended. It helps build the gas station industry, the tire industry, and so on and so on and so on. Motels and all of those things will develop partially as a result of this expanded highway program. This better transportation network allows people to live further and further out from the central business district of the cities and towns that they live in. You can buy a nicer, bigger house for a lot less than it would cost so-called in town, where the land was already developed and prices had already started to go up. And so people start to move out to new planned communities, planned developments like the Levitt towns, which we'll talk about here in a minute. As people move out that way, though, you start to see a few new things pop up. One of the things is that you're going to see a lot more convenience items begin to show up. Also, this is partly a result of the number of people traveling on the roads, but you start to see national brands of things like hamburger chains, McDonald's, for example, where Ray Kroc just comes with a brilliant idea after he buys the burger joint and turns it into a chain through franchising. But people like to go to those places because they know what they're going to get. Not that it's the best hamburger in town, but you know what you're getting. And when you're traveling, that's nice. That's comforting. People like to know that. How do we know that that's true? Look how many McDonald's there are. Okay. But they bring those out to where people live. It's a convenience factor. you can just stop, grab a quick meal, and take it home if you don't have time to cook that day because, boy, you've just been swamped. Mom didn't have time to cook today because she had this and that and the other thing, all of this stuff that they had to do. And so she'll just stop by and grab a bag full of burgers and rush home and feed the family that. And that happened. And the other thing that you see is the rise of things like shopping centers and shopping malls, which had not really existed before. The old way of shopping meant that you went to a department store. Generally, it was downtown, one big store, multiple stories, in a fairly large building. The old Neiman Marcus in downtown Dallas is a great example of this. And, the original Macy's department store in New York, and so on and so on, or Bloomingdale's or Nordstrom's or whatever. And these are just these large buildings, multiple floors, and each floor had different departments on it, right? And so you could go to one place and get all the different sorts of things you needed. Very convenient, but not so convenient if you live out in the suburbs. So they start building them in the suburbs, and they build them in groups together, and they turn this into our modern day shopping malls. And here's a map showing areas where population size is increasing. The red dot in the center is the population, is representative of the population in 1950. The black ring is the increase to 1980. And while most of the cities have some of a black ring, look at the size of Los Angeles. It went from relatively small, 5 to 9 million in the neighborhood, up to the 13 to 18 million in the neighborhood in just 30 years. That's huge growth. Okay, look at the percentages of growth in every state grows in population except for West Virginia. West Virginia actually loses population as they move to the cities. But few job opportunities is the big thing. But if you look where the majority of the growth was, you'll see that it's in the South and the West, the so-called Sun Belt. And people were moving to these states, places like Florida, Texas, California, Arizona, Louisiana, Georgia, all of these areas, for a variety of reasons, but low taxes, a mild climate, and plenty of space for these sprawling new suburb developments that are being created help draw the people there. How much so? Well, by 1970, California is the largest state, it has the highest population in the country, and its economy at that time would have placed it as the 10th largest economy, if it was its own country, in the world. So only 9 countries had more of an economic, including the U.S., had more of a productive economy than just the state of California. Nowadays, I think they would be about 5th, and Texas would be something like 7th or 8th if we were separate nations. Suburban expansion was also tied to the expansion of the military-industrial complex. A lot of the places that are growing are growing because they're building new things like Air Force bases. San Antonio had several Air Force bases around it, for example. Houston growing as the oil industry expands to help provide more fuel for the military-industrial complex, as well as the space industry, which gets largely based out of Houston. Why? That would be because of LBJ, who gets the Johnson Space Center put here. LBJ being Lyndon Baines Johnson, a influential congressman from Texas who later becomes vice president and president. He manages to get the majority of NASA located here because it's good for Texas. So life is changing, and there are differences between urban living and suburban living, as people are beginning to discover at this time. Middle-class whites moved out of the city to the suburbs. Working-class blacks moved into the cities at the same time. Why? Because as the middle-class whites moved out, that left a housing vacancy situation. When there's less people that want it than there are empty places to live, that causes prices to go down. It becomes more affordable Plus, it's closer to the centers of work for people, so it's less expensive for them to get to work. And so you have working class blacks moving into the cities at the same time. But then they change over factories. They begin to mechanize even more. It reduces the number of jobs available. And what happens is a lot of people become unemployed and broke. And now they can't afford to leave because it costs money to move. Sorry about that. It's my dog. Um, Urban planners add to this problem by creating housing projects. They're trying to do something good. They create large apartment complexes and things where people with very low incomes can afford to live or given a place to live. But really all that does is concentrate the poverty into one area. Now, this is an unintended consequence. They didn't mean to do this, but it definitely happens. Of course, when you concentrate poverty into one area, the simple fact of the matter is people who are poor are more likely to commit crimes. And so you get, because they're desperate. It's not that they're bad people, it's just that they're desperate people, and that causes people to do things that they wouldn't normally do if they're like, worried about going hungry. And so this creates a higher crime rate, urban despair. People would just get locked into these cycles of poverty and crime. Nobody else wants to move into the area. High crime rate. And so it just deteriorates more and more and more. Okay. There was a definite racial component to it. Segregation is increased, but it was, again, probably an unintended consequence rather than an intentional one. You don't want to have the government forcing you to live someplace where you don't want to live, but which we don't do in this country. But at the same time, what that does is it does tend to concentrate people of the same socioeconomic classes together. And since historical reasons had created a lot of that based on racial reasons, it just gets all tied together, and you see it happening widespread. I mentioned earlier that there was a big housing boom, and part of that is because of an innovation by a fellow by the name of William J. Levitt. And what Levitt does is he applies mass production techniques to home building. And he starts with a community sort of as a test project in Long Island, New York. And because they're building the houses exactly the same way, and because they put together pieces of it in a factory and then bring those pieces like segments to the location to be put together, it's a very efficient and therefore less expensive way of building houses. And so what you get is less expensive houses. A house like this one in the background in 1947 cost just shy of $8,000. It's not a very fancy house. You've got probably 2 bedrooms. Bathroom wouldn't have been counted as one of the rooms. A living room and a kitchen, okay, or a family room and a kitchen. So 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, living room and kitchen kind of thing. $8,000, including all the kitchen appliances, your stove, your refrigerator, your oven, not a dishwasher. Dishwasher would have been extra probably. That's about $76,000 today. Not a whole lot of money, right? And that made it really affordable. You throw in that between the VA and this new Federal Housing Administration offering low-cost mortgages, you got a massive post-war housing boom. What you saw happen was communities that were homogenous, typically young, white, middle-class families. They would put into the deeds what are called restrictive covenants, which said literally you could not sell your home to anyone who was not white. That's illegal, and it's been struck down. The NAACP and other groups challenged that and threw it out in 1948, but it took 20 years for anything to happen. They made it illegal, and yet it still continued. Essentially, they were just a little less obvious about it. It's one reason why nowadays it's very uncommon, for example, for the buyer and the seller to ever actually meet, is to make sure that there is not some sort of racist issue in someone selling their home to someone else. I've never met, for example, the people that were selling the house until after all the paperwork was signed. And the idea is to prevent, typically a white family from refusing to sell to a black family simply because they're black, which is crap. You shouldn't do that sort of thing. It's besides the fact that it's illegal, it's just wrong. But that's really what the Fair Housing Act is going to help do, is create a law that says it's illegal to do that. And here you can see that first Levittown development on Staten Island, New York. And you see the picture on the left. That was right after it was built. The trees are all fairly small, and the houses, look how similar they are, because they were all built to just a few very common plans. And yet you can see they all have yards. They have nice wide streets in front of them. They all have trees. It's a very nice area to live in, and it drew a lot of people out there. And you can see in the picture on the right hand, from a slightly different angle, this is the same place, it's just at a different angle, and you can see that people have added on to the houses and such. The trees are much larger, of course, after time. Those trees grew up and everything, and it's not exactly the same. There have been some changes, but it's still similar enough. You can still see the bones of the original planned development in the more lived-in version to the right. And so, as you can see, the burbs are booming. Baby booming, I guess, is the way to really put it. That post-war baby boom began in 1946, ran till 64, with 75 million babies being born. And those baby boomers have helped drive the focus of the economy ever since. And I've already really discussed this. But while babies were born pretty much, obviously, everywhere, the new suburbs, this was the playground, the heavenly playground. It's just amazing place for the kids to grow up in because they had so much. One of the big social pressures of the 1950s was conformity, and we're going to talk about that here in just a second. But the point of it was that people were afraid of subversives, people who were different, who might want to look like they were just regular people for the most part, but there was something just a little bit off about them. And what that little bit off part meant was that really they weren't real Americans, and what they really wanted to do was destroy American society. And people watched out for that sort of thing. It was really, people called the FBI and things, say, hey, my neighbor's doing something really kind of weird. Maybe you should check them out. And they did it. Okay, so conformity, fitting in, was a big deal, and it's pushed through media and family values, and just everybody to a large degree in the 50s is just totally pushing this concept of conformity. Be normal. Be like everyone else. Nowadays, we don't really buy into that near as much. There's still a lot of it, don't get me wrong, but we're way more able to express individuality now than we were in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, heck, even the 90s and so on. It's come a long way since then. And of course, we're talking about the era of the Cold War, the post-war years, and Hollywood is going to be the, still, TV takes over in the 50s, but they're really, the 40s and really early 50s is just the heyday of filmmaking and the huge boom period for Hollywood as overseas markets began to reopen and as people had more disposable income and free time and everything. It was just huge. And the boom's going to be ended by HUAC and the competition from TV. But popular film genres included film noir, which usually had this femme fatale character. This was a woman who was not living the societal norm of Little Miss Mary Pure, little Betty Do Good. And she used sex to influence men. She dressed provocatively. They never obviously showed them actually having sex or anything, but at least not in a mainstream film. Yes, adult films existed at that time. There's not a new technology that hasn't been used for sexualization to make money. But they used sex to influence men and to gain power over men, rather than being sort of shrinking back from it, and while maybe being loving and affectionate, but not overtly sexual, which was traditionally what female characters were like. So this femme fatale character is trying to escape this social norm, and sometimes it even come out and say it. I'm not a mother. I'm no housewife or whatever. But they were shown as an aberration, that they were not the norm. And a lot of times they were shown as the bad guys. They were, the agents of foreign powers, which means Russia, as a subversive agent. She was a spy trying to trick the lead scientist of the new atomic secrets or whatever, and she would try to seduce him and steal the secrets and stuff like that. And that was in a lot of movies, okay? And it showed these women that were not living a quote-unquote normal life as a threat. And of course, anti-communism, this is again a reaction to all the HUAC investigations we talked about previously, was another strong theme. And that also puts an emphasis on conformity. Watch out for those people who are different and everything. They're subversives and they want to overthrow our good old-fashioned American way of life, which was really not all that old-fashioned at that point. We're all alike. Join us. Join us. These are, obviously photos of people who are very similar. You have a college class picture there, all young white men in suits. The fellow in the couple of fellows in the darker suits, look how much they stand out from the guys in the lighter gray suits, or the one or two that are wearing a bow tie versus a full long tie. I mean, they all have similar haircuts. They look very much the same, right? Why? Because that's the image that they were expected to get. And so that's what they did. The little children in the class portrait, all the little girls wearing their nice little dresses, all the little boys in their shirts and pants, and so look how many of them are in their little Cub Scout uniforms. Why? Because we're part of a group that's all conforming, right? Okay. The little kids playing with the hula hoops, the fads that came out. That's a symptom of conformity. Oh well, so little Betty Sue has a hula hoop. I better get one too. I want to be like Betty Sue. I want to, why can't I have one? And so this silly hoop of plastic with a marble in it makes a few guys very, very wealthy. But there are hints of social change happening, even in this time of we're all going to be this way. And so there are challenges to the stereotypical social norms. In 1947, Jackie Robinson is going to break the color barrier in professional sports when he starts playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers. In 1948, Alfred Kinsey will report on human sexuality for the first time. His work will be published, and it shed some light on some things that people just thought were, nobody does that. Turns out maybe they do. In 1948, President Truman is going to issue Executive Order 9981, ending segregation in the armed forces, something that had been going on since since the American Revolution, really. We'd had segregation in the armed forces since that point. So at the same time that there's an increased demand for conformity and a distrust of people who are different and therefore seen as some sort of a threat or a subversive threat. Changes are still taking place. So change is going to happen even when people push against it. We have changes happening in marriages, in how we raise children, medicine, and these all kind of tie together. You see a massive increase in what's called companionate marriage versus arranged marriage. Companionate marriage is where you choose a person to marry because you enjoy their company. You want to be with them. It's a much more romantically influenced way of choosing a mate rather than the more financially or economically based system which is generally the basis for arranged marriages. Age at marriage is going to fall. It goes down to 21 for men and 20 for women. Again, that's part of the affluence. People can afford to get married and move out and set up households on their own more when there's more money out there. It used to be people waited longer because they had to get established, and it took longer to do that before this post-war boom. In the 1950s, families are going to raise up to 3.2 children on average, which is going to peak in 57, but remains high through the early 60s. Dr. Benjamin Spock is going to write a book called Baby and Child Care in 1946, which sold over 1 million copies every year after it was published for decades. And he revised it occasionally and everything, but in it he gave so-called expert advice on child rearing using what was described as a common sense approach. It was very cookie cutter, but so many people, I mean, 1 million copies a year, right? 1 million moms can't be wrong, except they can. And they followed his advice. I mean, some people virtually as if it was a religion. Well, he's the expert. Got to follow the expert. Well, that's what everyone else is doing. And let's see what Dr. Spock has to say about it. Well, some of it was good advice and some of it wasn't. Why do I have expert in quotation marks? Well, the guy was a pediatrician. Okay, so yeah, he dealt with children's health and things, but he hadn't really truly studied child rearing. One of the things that it said was that good mothers stayed home and raised their kids. And if you didn't do that, you were cheating your child. And of course, that made the moms who economics made have to work outside the home, and that was true of pretty much most working class families. And of course, any single mom, if you were a mother who's, had kids right before the war or during the war, and then your husband went off to fight and got killed, now you're a single mom. You got to work to raise and to pay for things to help raise those kids. And, here's this expert saying that you're a bad mom for doing that. That's kind of a crappy thing to say. The other thing that's going to happen is changes and advances in medicine. Big things, 2 huge things have come out during this time period. One is penicillin and other antibiotic type drugs that are going to start eradicating lots of diseases. And they'd been developed starting before World War II, but they were always in limited supply. After World War II, they're widely available, and doctors start giving it out for everything. And in the long run, we find out that's not such a great idea, but at the time they didn't realize that. It totally changes the way doctors are going to deal with illnesses. Rather than having to just deal with symptoms, now they can actually attack the root cause of the problem by killing the bacteria with antibiotics. And that's going to change quality of life. People are going to live longer and healthier lives as a result of it. Overuse causes some problems, which we're seeing now, but we didn't realize that back at the time. Another big step forward is Jonas Salk will develop a vaccine for the disease polio in 1952. And polio was a terrible disease. It hit kids mostly. It could strike adults, but it mostly hit kids. It killed several thousand a year. It killed a lot of people. but it also, if you survived it, it typically left you partially paralyzed. And some people had to be put into essentially ventilators for the rest of their life, called an iron lung. And some people, like, for example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, former president of the United States, who had polio, he caught it as a young man, not as a child, but left them virtually unable to walk, twisted their limbs up, and things like that. So polio was a terrible disease. And Jonas Salk developed a polio vaccine in 1952, and 10 years later, essentially, polio was gone from the United States and most industrialized Western nations. And this is just a chart of birth rates. And you see how over time, from the Civil War until really about the start of World War II, that declined steadily. And that's as people leave the farms, go into the cities, and become factory workers, where having big families is less of an economic bonus and more of an economic hardship. And so you see that constantly dropping birth rate. And then you hit the 40s and 50s and 60s, and it jumps up quite a bit at that point. And then it's been coming back down since then. You get a little bit of an echo boom in the 70s as the children of the 40s and 50s start having kids of their own. But they don't have as many. And you see that even decreasing even more now in America at aging rate. Now, Dr. Spock said that a mom working outside the home hurt their family, hurt their children. And that creates a lot of tension, like I said, in the minds of women who had to work outside the home. They had to be a producer or provider, not simply a consumer. But the domestic ideal, what you saw on TV, was June Cleaver over here to the right, who gets up in the morning and puts on her makeup and gets in her heels and her dress, puts on her pearls, and then she goes and makes everyone breakfast. So she's up so much earlier just so that she can make sure that everybody has a good breakfast. And not only is she up, but she's gotten all made up and everything. And the question, of course, is, did women really do this? Some of them did. If you were wealthy enough, you did. Most women did not. Most women didn't go to this extreme, but it did happen. If you have never seen it, it's a great program right now on Amazon called The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. In the pilot episode, there's an amazing scene. I'm trying to get a copy of it, but haven't been able to yet, where she and her husband go to bed, and she's wearing full makeup, her hair is perfect and everything. He goes to sleep, she gets up, goes into the bathroom, cleans her face, puts on the cold cream, puts her hair in curlers, all of this stuff, then goes and gets back in bed, sleeps, and then before he wakes up, she gets up again, sneaks into the bathroom, puts her makeup and everything back on, gets her hair done and everything, and goes and lays back down in bed just before he wakes up. And she did it every night, so that she went to bed looking perfect, and she woke up. When he went to bed, she looked perfect. When he woke up, she looked perfect. And all of the effort she put into doing that. And people did that. Let's see. In working, however, more than 80% of women who did work did what was, called women's work. Basically, jobs traditionally held by women. They were clerks, they were waitresses, they were stewardesses on planes, now called flight attendants, but they call them stewardesses, and maids, cooks, telephone operators, receptionists, like I said, sales clerks in department stores and things, nurses. 97% of all nurses were women. Only 3% of the nurses in the world were men, or in the U.S. were men. That number is much higher now. It's still a field dominated by women. School teachers, mostly women, especially at the lower grades. When you got to the higher grades, you saw far more men teaching in the high schools. But from middle school down, almost all women. That's still true as well. But only 6% of the 6% of the physicians were female, because society didn't expect women to be doctors. And of those, almost all of them were in one of two fields: obstetrics and gynecology, or pediatrics. Um, in 1963, women's pay would average about 60% of a man's for the same job. That's partly a holdover from the days when it was assumed that any woman was working as a supplement to her husband's income and didn't really have to support the family on what she made, which, as we all know, is nonsense. But women doing that work did help many families to reach that middle class threshold. Because even though they made less, they were bringing in more money. Now let's talk about sex for a minute. Everybody loves talking about sex. Oh, wait, you don't? Okay, well, anyway, we're going to. It's an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people, but at the time, the ideal and what was, again, promoted socially and through the media and everything was that American men and women channeled their sexual energy into a marriage. You didn't fool around outside of marriage beyond the occasional chaste peck or of a kiss or holding hands or putting your arm around your girl at the movies or something. And that was basically as much physical affection as you were expected ever to show or to have between an unmarried man and woman. Of course, that's not an accurate depiction. People did have premarital sex back then. It increased during that period. The number of unwed mothers increased, still societally, absolutely verboten. This was the age of, oh, she's gotten pregnant. She's ruined. Well, she better get married. Well, he's not going to marry her. Well, let's send her off to, how many movies have got this as a plot line, where they send off the embarrassed pregnant girl to have her baby at some aunt's, and then they're going to put it up for adoption, and then she's going to move back after taking a school year off to go live with her aunt out in the some other town. Happened all the time. And certainly, at least in the movies, it happened pretty frequently. It was just socially not acceptable. You didn't do that. Good girls didn't do that. I don't know why it's not good boys didn't do that, but that's the way they put it. And of course, we know that they did, and that it doesn't really make them bad people. It's just the way people are. But as they got more and more freedom to move, particularly with the expansion of the ownership of automobiles, for example, you're going to see that sort of thing happen more. This fellow who's a zoologist, he studies animals, and he decided to study the human animal. So he's studying people as if they were animals, and did a lot of work on sexual behavior. He worked for the Indiana University. His name is Dr. Alfred Kinsey, and he published his first book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, in 1948, continued his research, shifting focus to women, and published that book 5 years later in 1953. And what he did was he took a scientific approach to sexual practices and finding out what people actually did. And he used a variety of different techniques, and his conclusions really challenged assumptions on a lot of sexual practices, especially the cases of homosexuality, premarital sex, and marital infidelity. And what it's showing is that, a sexual revolution has begun. People's beliefs and ideas about sex are changing. Even though they're not showing it, they are doing it. And his work is going to be widely criticized. Easy for him to say. Professional statisticians said, well, he doesn't have a big enough sample. He's got his methods are just full of flaws, and this is not, you can't say this is a general study. Religious leaders and civic leaders condemned it as a degrading portrait of eroding American morals, and said this guy is trying to convince people that all of this stuff is normal, and so that they'll start doing it, and then all of our traditional values are just going to go right down the drain, blah, 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 and so on. Okay. But what he says is that 37% of men and 13% of women had engaged in some sort of homosexual activity by early adulthood, whether that was just fantasizing or actual physical activity, that there was some level of homosexual activity by the time they were early adults, in their 20s, basically. And that 10% of all men were exclusively homosexual, not basically not at all attracted to women, even though most of those men would have gone ahead and gotten married and just basically hidden their homosexuality, because, again, society at the time, as we all know, totally not cool with that concept. But some people were, and you see the beginnings of gay activism in the homophile movement. Homophile simply means those who love the same. Okay, and so it's a very fancy way of saying homosexual without throwing in sex. And so you start to see gay and lesbian activist organizations starting. The first is the Mataquinda Society in 51, which was really for gay men, and the Daughters Bilitis in 55, which is for lesbians. And both of these groups advocated equal rights. They wanted to, but they encouraged their members to avoid gay bars and gay clubs. They want to be seen as just average, everyday, normal people who happen to be attracted to members of their sex rather than the opposite. And so they say, look, don't act outrageously. Be conservative. Just be normal people. And and if people find out that you're homosexual, well, so what? You're just like everybody else, except in who you love. And that's the move that they push. But it's a start, and it's going to lay the foundations for later gay rights movement, which really kicks off in the 70s. And unfortunately, we're just not going to have time to get to that point this year. Another thing where you had sort of a rebellious culture against conformity is in the youth culture, as these teenagers start to grow up and become a thing. Right before the 1950s, teenager was there wasn't such a thing. It wasn't like you went from being a kid to being a grown up, and there was very little of this overlapping adolescent period in the teen years. But in the 50s, largely as a marketing thing, largely as a concept of the baby boom, teenager becomes a thing. You get this era where you're pushing for more and more freedom and independence and things, while yet still having the responsibility level of a child. You want the independence of an adult and the responsibility of a child, and it doesn't really work that way, except that during your teen years it sort of is, as you're transitioning through. And so this becomes a phenomenon in the 1950s. And one of the things that's going to be typical of it is the rejection of the music styles of the parents. And this is what's going to give birth to rock and roll music, where you get music inspired by African American rhythm and blues and tie it with Southern style folk music, and you get rock and roll. And the name itself actually even comes from blues code words for sex that were put into blues tunes. And they call it rocking and rolling. And of course, what they mean is the body's rocking and rolling in the course of having sex. And because people knew that, all right, people knew what that meant. A lot of adults view it as basically an invitation to sexualize their kids, and were really opposed to it. They called it dirty music, filthy rock and roll. A lot of people, racist attitudes, didn't like it because it had African American roots to it. And there was a lot of that. And really, the father of it, well, we'll talk about him in a second, but and we'll talk about Elvis as well. They're two different people, by the way. Um, but so this is a form of rejection of their parents' value system, their parents' norms, and we're going to do our thing. And you see more and more of that. You see cultural dissenters. Uh, it's a small percentage, but they're there, and you typically saw them in bigger cities. You know, it's hard to be the lone or one or two people who stand out of a crowd in a small town versus the couple of hundred in a big city. At least you've got some support, right? Um, and so you get bebop music, which is an improvisational jazz form enjoyed by young blacks, and a group of people called the Beats, which is short for beatniks. These were the writers and poets on both coasts, New York and San Francisco, who become very popularized. They discuss things like sexual adventurism, spontaneity, the use of drugs as recreationally and sort of experimentally, just to see, you know, and to help spark creativity in things. And also a new form of spirituality, sort of like New Age spiritualism too. Probably the king of these guys, as far as poets is concerned, is a fellow by the name of Jack Kerouac. But their culture is going to begin to influence things, and they're really sort of like proto hippies. They're rejecting some parts of traditional society and focusing on different parts of it, but they haven't gone full hippie yet. As promised moments ago, here we have the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, on the left, and really the guy I consider to be the true father of it is Chuck Berry, the gentleman on the right with the guitar, who was just an amazing performer and who really did help to create this musical form, even though Elvis is called the king of it. Chuck Berry absolutely can't be overlooked, his importance, and there's just and lots of other artists, Bill Haley and the Comets, Ricky Nelson, who brought it sort of a little bit more mainstream with his sweet little love ballads and his sort of everyday Joe kind of face. And all of the various other artists. There's so many. It's just Fats Domino and God, there's so many. But these are the people that created rock and roll, and from that you start seeing other musical forms begin to develop. This musical form will influence people around the world. It's going to have its own spin-offs from other countries as they add their bits to it. You get the British invasion of the 60s, where British groups like the Beatles is of course the king of it, but the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Monkees, all of these groups the Birds, the Animals, Herman's Hermits, uh, Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs, although I think they were American. Anyway, um, they're going to bring their own style of it back to the U.S. and shift how we do it, and it interweaves back and forth, and it's really kind of an interesting thing. But that's for a whole other course. And that's going to do it for the middle class and the 50s and mainstream and counterculture America during that time. And so the next thing we're going to discuss, and it'll be our last lecture of the semester, is the civil rights movement of the 50s and early 60s is the era we're going to focus on. So until then, y'all take care.